If you don't have your Bibles this morning, there's black Bibles in front of you that are passages found on page 875. So as we learned a couple weeks ago, that the book of Daniel was written, it was written at the time during the exile, the captivity, when the nation of Israel was being punished by God to come in because of their rebellion against worshiping God. They decided to worship the gods of the land and everything else like that. And what they ended up doing is that God was preparing the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, and his empire to come and to destroy Jerusalem and to take all the Israelites, his people, into exile as punishment. And Daniel was written not to prophesy that, but it was written to, number one, prophesy the first coming of Christ. And more importantly, it was there to basically to do two things. That God is sovereign over all things and that he is in control of what is happening despite what is perceived. Even though it looks like that the people of Israel had been forgotten, God was working through these evil kingdoms, bringing about the plan to bring his seed upon the world. Not only that, but what we also see is we see this idea that it was also written as a way to comfort the people while they were in exile, that God had not forgotten them, that he was going to be faithful to his promises, and that once again, God will restore them to their land. And what we see is that Nebuchadnezzar was coming upon the scene and he was conquering everything. And as country by country, nation by nation, city by city, he came, he laid siege to them, and he devastated the people. But there was a problem with world domination, is that eventually, as you conquer more and more land, it becomes too vast to police. You become too great, too large, and you have too many people to keep control of. And then portions of your empire begin to rebel. Every empire that has come and gone has had this problem. And so that's one of the nasty side effects. But Nebuchadnezzar had a plan to do this. So what would happen is that as he would conquer a city, he would go and he would take the brightest and the best of their people, and he would bring them back to the land to re-educate them. And that's where we see at the beginning of Daniel, we begin to see that Daniel and his friends were removed, renamed, and re-educated, so to respond, to react to Babylonian culture positively. So that's what we see. We see this idea that at the beginning of this text, we begin to see that the best and the brightest of the Jewish people were taken into captivity first. And they weren't put in jail, but they were put in to Babylonian University to basically be brainwashed, to be re-educated, so that those people would be transformed from being Jewish to Babylonian. And what would happen is that, and then he put them to work for himself. So there was positive aspects to this. Is that number one is that was a way to get more people to work for your kingdom. You take them from other nations and you hollow out their cultures and bring them to you. But more positively, that this was a way to keep the other nations from rebelling. Because if you take away your kids and you bring them and you put them in high-ranking positions with the king, more than likely those countries aren't going to rebel. Because if you rebel against the king, they could end up killing your children. But not only that, it was a way to where also that as the people who were taken into captivity in the king's court, they become more and more Babylonian, they would be able to go back home and try to sing the positive praises of the new king. So this is where we are in the story. Nebuchadnezzar, was brilliant about how coming in to keep peace in his empire, to bring people, to re-educate them for their plan. He developed a very effective plan to brainwash these four men and their thousands of Jewish brothers that were coming in with them. And he wasn't brainwashing them in the religion of the seed of God, Yahweh, but he was brainwashing them into the religion of the serpent. And what we see in this chapter is that Daniel and his 3 friends did more than just survive the brainwashing. They thrived despite the brainwashing. So what we see in this chapter, Daniel's letting us into this thing, the idea that Daniel and his 3 friends' faithful actions led them to thrive in a toxic culture. And I think that's the same thing we need to do today. We live in a culture, while we can sit there and say it's not Babylonia. We can sit there and say, yeah, we live in America, we have lots of freedoms and stuff like that, but I think we still live in a culture that slowly is eroding to become more and more like the world and less like God. And in that, what we see is that just as there was pressure for Daniel and his 3 friends to compromise, we also are pressured to compromise our faith, our beliefs, our actions, so that we may be admired or accepted by the people of this culture. So today, as we look at this idea, we're going to see that just as Daniel's faithful actions led them to thrive in a culture that's toxic to their faith, what steps do we need to take place to do that same thing? Not only to survive, but to thrive. Not only to push back the idea of being brainwashed, the idea of pushing back the idea of becoming more like culture, but how do we have an influence and an impact upon the culture around us? So look with me in starting with verse 3. What we see here, what Daniel writes. So we see that verse 3 says, Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, used without blemish, of good appearance, was skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of the time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them new names. Daniel he called Belshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. So the first thing that we see here is that there's pressure to compromise in a toxic culture. And there are 2 ways that they were pressured to change. They were pressured to change their thinking, and they were pressured to change how they were living. Think about that. Look at verses 4 and 5. Look at the end. It says, and they were brought to Babylon, and they were brought there to the king's palace so that they could teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. And then it goes on and says they were to be educated for 3 years. And at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Now, this isn't just going like, let's say, hey, we're moving to Mexico. So we're going to go take language classes to learn Spanish, and we're going to take historical classes to learn the history of the people and the customs of the people. That's kind of, if you're a missionary, that's what you do. If you're going over to Southeast Asia, you go to a class for 6 to 7 months and you learn the ways of the people, the culture of the people, the history of the people, and the language of the people, so that you can have an impact upon them. Because you don't go over there to someone where that they don't speak English and you expect them to teach them your language. No, you learn their language to teach them. But that isn't what is going on here. Instead, the Babylon, the whole purpose of this was to teach the Jewish people the whole worldview of Babylon. It was to promote the Babylonian view of man, the Babylonian view of God, and how many gods they had, what they thought about sin, and how they thought about redemption, And what was happening is that these 3 years of education was directly opposed to everything that these 4 men had learned in the past 17, 18 years while in Israel. In fact, one author concludes that undoubtedly one of the subjects Daniel and his friends would have taught was the Babylonian art of divination, the idea of dream interpretation. So as Daniel and his 3 friends would go through this, I was actually listening to a podcast about the roots of magic. And the very foundation, the roots of magic, come from Babylon. If you remember in Genesis 11, that right after the flood, all men came to want to rule themselves and they built the Tower of Babel. Remember that story? And then God confused the language and everybody dispersed among the world, and that's how we have nations, that's how we have languages, that's how we have different people groups now across the world is because of that. But what happened is that there was a group of people that stayed in Babylon. And from that, we see was that they practiced what was called the dark arts, witchcraft, necromancy, divination. And it just grew over the thousands of years until we come to the empire of Babylon. And their whole culture was seeped in all of this. So it just wasn't like reading Harry Potter and the little story about all that. It wasn't just reading about Merlin and stuff like that, but this whole culture was enveloped into the religion of the serpent, the religion of Satan, and the darkness that it had. They would learn how to make predictions by interpreting unusual celestial phenomenon. So they would have looked at the eclipse that we had a couple weeks ago, and they would try to interpret to see what the gods were saying. Now we need to understand that eclipse had no message for us except that God had put, when he put the world into motion, that this would happen on a regular basis, that there would be a full solar eclipse. In fact, NASA has already, if the Lord tarries, has already predicted whenever every lunar or solar eclipse will happen for the next 100 or so years. It's a natural process of what we have, but people looking at the skies would sit there and say, oh, what are the gods trying to tell us? They would sit there and they would live by omens and dreams, because that was the way they thought that their gods primarily revealed their wills and intentions. So think about this. Every day for 3 years, Daniel and his 3 friends would go to these Babylonian university. Every day, they would learn and be taught things that contrary to what the Word of God says. And over and over and over again, they would be that. And we need to understand that this is kind of what the purpose of the wise men would be. They would be trained, they would be learned men, and they would go and they would be counselors to the king. And we will see next week when Nebuchadnezzar has a bad dream, who does he call? These very men who he trained. Interpret my dream. So you know how they would do that? A lot of times they would sit there and a king or a leader would have a dream, and they would go take a sheep and they would butcher it, and they would take the liver out. And they would study the liver. And then from that, they would receive what the message of the dream was, or supposedly what the message would be. Can you imagine what they went through when they went through these classes? But they resisted the pressure to change their thinking. Even the Babylonians went so far to change their names, to take the name of God, Yahweh, completely out of their names, and says, you're no longer servants of Yahweh, but you're servants of our gods, Marduk. And what we see is that they changed their identity. They tried to change their thinking. And I think the same thing is happening to us. Maybe not at that small, direct level. But every day, we as Christians have pressure to change how we think about things. To change our thinking comes from our schooling, comes from our television, comes from the news, comes from science. or so-called science. You know, one thing the world tries to do, one of the things that the world tries to do, I think, is very subtle. But over time, that subtlety makes big changes. We change the words that we use. We try to soften the language of our faith to the language of the world. When I was in seminary back in Louisville, as I was going through school, I worked for UPS for a little bit of time, but I also was a salesperson in advertising media sales. And my sales manager, who never liked to say, well, you could never use one word in his presence, and we could never use one word when we were trying to communicate with our customers, and that was the word problem. He says, well, you never have problems. You have issues. You have roadblocks. So every time he'd sit there and say, hey, there's an issue with this person's bill. No, it was really a problem. Their check bounced. So you're not getting your commission, or they're taking the commission back from you, and also they're not able to do the advertising platform they wanted. So you had to go and talk to the customer, and he says, by saying it's an issue, it becomes much more easier to solve. If it was a problem, then people have that view that there's nothing that can be done. So it was a less harsh way of trying to sit there and say, hey, we need to work something out. And I think that's exactly what happens in our Christian faith. One of the things we do is that a word like sin. Nobody likes that word, right? Everything, we have 4-letter words that we say are bad. But but to the world, sin is a terrible word because it has, that's a sin. Well, we don't like to do that. We don't like that concept. So instead of it, we change it to sickness. We change it to dysfunction. We change it to an alternative lifestyle. So what we have done is that we have taken what God has called sin, and we have tried to soften it to try to get approval from other people to not to look at us a bad way. But what we need, and sometimes we not only do we change it or soften it, but we trivialize it. I imagine how many of you brought desserts today? That's it? Man, this is not going to be a fun get-together. No, I'm just joking. It's probably going to be a healthier get-together. No, but, we sit there and we look at, you get a cheesecake from Walmart. They're small. You take one bite, you take one slice and then another and then another, and then you go say, man, it would be a sin to eat the whole dessert, but I'm going to try. We say that, and I don't think it's necessarily bad, but we do that with all these different types of ways. And slowly, culture, the people of the world are trying to change how we do things. And we need to stand and resist, just like Daniel and his 3 friends. Because the world is trying to change us, to change our thinking, but also to change our living. Look again with me, starting with verse 8. It says, but Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see you who are in worse condition than the youths of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Let our appearance and the appearance of our youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this manner and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were better in the appearance and fatter in the flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine, and they were to drink. And they were to drink and give them vegetables. And as for the 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill and all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians, the enchanters that were in his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. So what we see is that there was pressure for them to change the way that they were living. So until this point, Daniel and his friends, there was no outward resistance on anything. He didn't sit there and say, hey, I don't want to learn that, so I'm not going to read the book. I'm not going to go to class. It seems like what we see is that Daniel and his 3 friends went to the classes, but yet they did not give in to the pressure to compromise. They didn't skip their Babylonian class. They answered to their Babylonian names. But what we see is that when it came to their diet, we see a resistance. Why? They said, we will not compromise. So we will not eat of the king's table. Give us vegetables and give us water. Why was the food so important to Daniel and his 3 friends? Why? Why did they not eat? Well, as I was studying, as I was looking, I think there were probably 5 different views for what this is. And I think there's only one true view, and you can see it's down at the very end. But look at verse 12. It says, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. So some people will sit there and say, well, Daniel and his 3 friends were vegetarians. That's kind of what it was. They wanted to be healthy. So they were vegetarians. In fact, maybe some of you have heard Rick Warren's book, The Daniel Plan, The Daniel Diet, right? You've heard that name before. Well, what was happening is that some time ago, Rick Warren was convicted about his health and some of the health of his leaders at the church. So he felt like they weren't being good stewards about that, so then God pressed upon him to do something. So this is what he said in his book. He said, since I was preaching that day about a man in the Bible named Daniel who refused to eat junk food and challenged the king to a health contest, I named my program the Daniel Plan. Well, what we see is that Daniel and his friends were not challenging the king to a health contest. In fact, it was not junk food that they refused. They weren't sitting there saying, oh, we're not going to have any Little Debbies. We're not going to eat cake or cheesecake. No, we're not going to eat fruit. We're not going to eat bread. We're not going to even eat meat. He goes on and says in his book, says the Daniel Plan introduces you to a whole new world of fresh fruits and vegetables, beans, whole grains, nuts, seeds, eggs, chicken, fish, lean or naturally raised animal products, and spices. So he based this whole diet and exercise plan to become healthy on what we see in Daniel chapter 1. Well, I think that's hard to do that because number one is that did Daniel and his friends eat fruit? Were they eating bread? Did they eat chicken? Did they eat fish? No. What did they eat? Vegetables. What did they drink? Water. No. They had, what we see in this passage is not a description. It's not a prescription of the diet Christians are to eat. If you eat this way, you will be more holy. If you eat this way, you're going to be more blessed by God. So what has happened is a lot of people take this and say, hey, God blesses those who eat vegetables, so I'm going to become a vegetarian. That is not what this says. Remember, when we read the narrative things of Scripture, it describes what is happening, but everything that is described in the Bible is not prescribed to us as Christians. If you go back to the book of Genesis, or even to look at the kings, King David, the story of King David. How many wives did King David have? At least 3, 4, or 5, and had a lot of other concubines. His son had more, 300 wives and 700 concubines or something like that. Now, is that prescribed today, or is that just describing A mistake that both David and Solomon did, yes. It's not prescribed, it's described. What we see is we need to understand that this is not a prescription of how to eat better so we can be better Christians. In fact, there's nothing more spiritual about a veggie diet compared to a meat diet. Is that right? Do I hear an amen from you? Catch me outside. Catch you outside, okay. All right. No, because in Genesis chapter 9, after the flood, God sits there and tells Noah to go ahead and eat of all the animals. It's okay to eat meat. Because I imagine we have meat today, right? So we can only eat any vegetables. We need to throw away all the meats, all the potato, all that other stuff. All we can eat is eat. We may have to go over to the Graber's house to actually get more vegetables. But, that's not what he's saying. Then there's also the thing is that, okay, the food was unclean. If you remember in Leviticus chapter 11 in the law, there were certain foods that the Israelites couldn't eat. You couldn't eat pork, right? So we're having ham tonight, right? Today? Nope, you got to throw away the ham. We'll just throw it away in my office. So, no, that's not what it was. Because if you quickly turn to Daniel chapter 10, Daniel chapter 10 very quickly in verse 3. Not only could they not eat certain foods, but they had to prepare them in certain ways. Why? Because it was a way to differentiate them, to separate themselves from the Gentile cultures around them. But Daniel chapter 10 says this, I ate no delicacies, no meat or wine entered my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all for the full 3 weeks. So what happens is Daniel's disturbed by a dream that God had given him. And so he decided not to eat meat for 3 weeks as he tried to figure this out until he got the answer. So did Daniel sit there and say, well, no, my faith is important to me now during these 3 years, but later on down in my life, I gave everything up and wanted to eat meat? No. What we see Daniel, who is constantly, persistently through the book, being faithful, not compromising. And also, there's no, inside the law, there was no prohibition to eat about how wine was to be fixed. But instead, he said vegetables and water. So it has nothing to do with the Old Testament laws. Some people say it was a political protest. Basically he's saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, you have no right authority over me, so therefore I'm not going to eat your food. Well, it was probably a pretty weak protest. Why? Because there was only one person outside those 4 men that knew it. The chief eunuch, the delivery boy. But not only that, where did the vegetables come from that they did eat? The king's table. There was no separate section on the menu saying everything from the king's table here, everything else from a private farm down the road for vegetables. Everything came, meat, vegetables, bread, all of it came from the king's table. Maybe there's some people say, well, the reason why they didn't eat was because the food was offered to idols. You go into the New Testament, you read about this in 1 Corinthians and also Romans, that there were Christians who refused to eat meat because they were saved out of the idea of idolatry. And they didn't want to eat meat because consciously they felt like they were eating food that was sacrificed to demons. Because in the Roman culture, all the meat that came in before it went to the butcher's place, before it went to the market, was sacrificed to the local idol. But we need to understand that we don't need to read something that happened in a different culture, in a different time, and completely in the New Testament into the Old Testament. In Rome, meat was offered to idols, but in Babylon, everything was offered to idols. Vegetables, fruit, bread, grain, everything. So what is the reason why this diet was there? It was not to make the people more healthy. Because look at this. It says right here, Look at verse 15. So we can know that this wasn't to sit there and say to make healthy choices. So the Daniel plan's purpose was not to make them thinner. Look at it. It says, at the end of the 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in the flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. This was not a diet as we see a diet. This is a way, this was the whole purpose. So this was a purpose, the diet, the purpose for Nebuchadnezzar, the reason why he gave them all this food was to make his men fatter. The reason why Daniel and his friends did not eat it was not to lose weight, but they wanted to sit there and they wanted to achieve the same results, not by the help of the king, but by the help of God alone. So what they did, there was nothing wrong with the food itself, but they thought, you know what? This is one area that we can sit there that the king is not going to control in my life, but I'm going to allow God to control it, God to be sovereign over it, and for God to work. So they ate vegetables and drank water in order to give God room to work, room to show his power, room to be sovereign. Now we need to remember that the goal of the food was not to make them look healthy, was not to make them lose weight, but to make them look well nourished. And if you go back and you look at Babylonian art that's been discovered, that we can tell from the art that the standards of what male beauty was. If we look at all the reliefs and everything that's been found, we see men depicted in two different ways. The first, the king and the warrior class, were indeed muscular, thin. You know, they looked like bodybuilders. They looked like people that used their hands, that were prepared for battle. But then what happens is that, on the other hand, if you were considered a wise man, if you're considered a counselor to the king, you know, if you were considered a political person, like Daniel and his colleagues, they were pictured in a different way. They were pictured as bald, big-eyed, which was a symbol of intelligence, and they were pictured chubby. And this is the look that Nebuchadnezzar was going for. So what was happening? Thus, at the end of the 3 years, Nebuchadnezzar evaluated Daniel and his three friends as the top of their class. He says, look at these people. Look at the education that I provided for them. They are knowledgeable. And even look at their demeanor. Look how fat and bald and big-eyed they are. That was because of me. But what we see is that Daniel and his three friends knew, as well as the reader of this book, knew that the good-looking in the Babylon sense, that they looked that way, they looked smart, they looked healthy, not because of the king, but because of God. God made them pleasantly plump, not the rich food or the wine or the king's table. So this whole time, as people are reading this, they're seeing that Nebuchadnezzar thinks he's in control. But what Daniel and his friends are telling the people of Israel is that, look, the king's not in control. God is in control. God has put us at the top of the class. Not the king, not his food, not his education. So despite the situation that they were in, we see that God is still in control. That Daniel and his three friends were eating only vegetables, but yet they were putting on pounds like somebody eating Little Debbie's 3 or 4 times a day. And think about this. He found them 10 times better than all magicians and enchanters that were in all of his kingdoms. That wasn't because they gave in to the pressures and the compromise. They were that way because God blessed them despite the circumstances they found them in. And how were they able to resist? How were they able to resist being assimilated into their culture? And how were they able to not only survive, but also thrive in that type of culture? Well, we see this idea that it was holiness. Holiness gave Daniel the power to thrive in a toxic culture. And what the story is telling us, that just as Daniel and his friends were faithful to God in the pressure to compromise, the way that we are to withstand the push and the pressure and the battle today to change our thinking, to change our living, to change our identity, is not to give in, not to just compromise a little bit, but we are to be faithful and we are to live holy lives. So as the pressure comes in our daily lives, in our jobs, in our schools, to act differently, to think differently, to believe differently than what we have been taught from God's word, God is calling us to be people to obey and to be faithful. So why are we to be why is holiness, why was being faithful so important to Daniel? Why is it important to us? Very quickly here, we see number one is we see holiness prepares us for God's work. Holiness prepares us for God's work. The first reason that God allowed them to face this small little test of the food is that it prepared Daniel and his friends for greater spiritual battles. Because after this, what we see is that the challenges, the pressures to compromise get harder, get even bigger and more risky and more dangerous. You know, think of the next 5 chapters that we're going to be looking over the next several weeks. There's going to be, the next chapter, Nebuchadnezzar has a bad dream. And he's going to kill all the wise men he just educated because they can't tell him what the dream was. And then we see in chapter 3 that there's this giant idol that he erects and says, you need to bow or you burn. And then we see the king's going to be turned into a wild animal. We see that Daniel is threatened to change his worship but if he doesn't, he's going to be thrown into the lion's den. Each trial leads to a new and greater challenge, and that's the point. That's what this book is. This thing is that the pressure to compromise continues not just once or twice in life, but continues regularly, and it gets harder, and the pressure becomes greater the more that we commit to being faithful. And what Daniel's showing us that each initial choice of holiness is preparation for later battles. I think what happens is that we have a tendency today that when we encounter pressure or hardship or trials, what happens is we first go to, Lord, why is this happening to me? What have I done? Why are you doing this? Why have you taken the blessing? Why is your presence gone? In fact, instead of doing that, instead of thinking that God has left us or that we have done something wrong, we need to think that this present trial is preparing us for future purposes. God is giving us this little hardship to give us experience, to strengthen us for something that's coming that's greater. But if we don't think that God is working, that there's a purpose to our hardship, a purpose to our trials, then what happens? We are overcome and we are discouraged. And then if we keep focusing that there's no purpose in this, we're just, why is this happening? Why is this happening? Instead of looking to see and asking God what is happening and learning from it, the discouragement will become discouraged, become overwhelmed, and it will destroy us. But what we can say is that we are told today that if we face our small battles today with hope, the Lord is going to help us through the larger battles as we come. We need to understand that present trials are preparation for tomorrow's battles. The Lord is using the pressure that we see today, that we experience today, to prepare us to be His instruments tomorrow when the pressure may be greater. Secondly, we see this idea that holiness protects us from sinful consequences. The reason why holiness is so important for us to compromise is because if we do compromise, if we are not faithful, then we get involved in sin, and that sin draws us away from God. And not only are we not being prepared, but holiness protects us from the consequences of the enemy's victories. You know, Daniel's going to face greater battles and decisions than the test of his diet. He will have greater decisions than whether to eat vegetables or sweets. As a consequence, he is sitting there saying, I will not defile myself in this one small little area. What we see is that he wants, his desire for holiness is to keep his heart close to God. And as a result, Daniel not only grows in knowledge of Babylon, but also he goes in understandings of visions and dreams from God. So while he grows in knowledge and he knows everything that all the other wise men are going to do, God blesses him. So Daniel will be protected as he is faithful for greater battles, and he's going to be protected by God because sin distanced God's people from his protections. You know, we're going to have the pressure to sit there and say, be tempted to sit there and just compromise just a little bit. Pressures are going to come, opportunities to compromise are going to be there. We're going to sit there and say, you know what, I'm just going to compromise just a little here because I need to do this. I need to be admired. I need to get this victory. And then I'm going to be faithful later. I'm going to do better later. But that's not what we see in Daniel. Daniel basically says, no, if we're not faithful in the easy compromises, then we're not going to be able to be faithful in the harder compromises. No matter what our pressures or present trials are, whether they're personal, private, moral, financial, or with family, if we are not preparing for tomorrow's battles with holiness today, we will not be spiritually strong enough to stand for the Lord later. And last, we see the reason is this idea that holiness provides opportunities to be an influence. Opportunities to be a witness. Think about that. Because Daniel stood and would not defile himself, he was able to have an impact upon his three friends who followed him and their faithful acts. And then we'll see in Daniel chapter 3 that when Daniel's nowhere to be found, we see these three friends stay faithful despite death staring them down. Why? Because Daniel was faithful. Not only that, but because Daniel was faithful, Daniel chose holiness over compromise. He had a powerful influence over the kings that stood above him. 3 Babylonian kings he had influence over, and at least one Persian king he had influence over. Why? Because he was faithful to God. There's a powerful influence of personal holiness that sometimes is missed in the quickness of compromise. That when we are faithful in little things, it makes a big difference to those around us. But we also need to understand, I don't want to sit there and say, as long as we are faithful, as long as we are holy, we're going to be blessed. We can't take that from Scripture. We need to understand that Jesus, who was the most faithful person in the world, never sinned, was more perfect and more holy than Daniel. What influence did he have? What happened to him? He was crucified. And that's why Paul says in 2 Timothy that all who desire to live a godly life in Christ will be persecuted. If Christ was persecuted for being holy, if Christ was persecuted for being faithful in God, don't be surprised when the world persecutes us when we don't compromise and we stand our ground. Don't think that just because we stand our ground, God's going to completely bless us all the time. That's not what this passage is saying. Yes, we have a greater opportunity to make an influence, a witness, when we are holy. But sometimes that holiness, that witness, comes at a great cost. But not only that, but we see that Daniel's witness, he was able to influence the people of Israel. We know from later prophecies of Daniel that the people of Israel go through many generations of heartache. They will often wonder, is God faithful? Does he care? Can he protect? The life of Daniel stood as a continuing witness to them that though the present may be difficult, God's promises are greater and he is faithful. So stay strong. Don't compromise. And we also see that even today, thousands of years removed from Daniel and his friends, Daniel's commitment to be faithful has made an impact upon us, upon the Christian faith. That we see this example that we are to follow. But at the same time, we need to understand that we should never minimize the danger and difficulty of holiness. The danger and difficulty of holiness. Because you know what happens? Is that we are all prone to serve certain idols. None of the idols do we have a statue. Hopefully none of the idols that I don't think any of us have a statue or a God at home that we bow to every day. But we have all these idols that we serve. We want to be successful. We want to be secure. We want pleasure. And we all just want to be accepted and loved, don't we? And many times all of our compromises go around that. The great thing is that think about the things that we desire most. That is going to be where the pressure to compromise is going to be the hardest. But there's also something we need to understand, is that if you look at Daniel, he basically, we look at Daniel who lived over 70 years plus in Babylon. But we are only given a picture, into a window to about 6 days of his life. And you know what? It's kind of like us today on Facebook, on social media, Instagram. Our lives look great, don't they? Before we put the pictures on, we kind of make sure that they look good. We take out all the bad things and we put them, we don't put the bad things on Facebook. But I imagine that Daniel sinned, Daniel failed, Daniel had bad days. He had failures where he gave in to compromise. We don't know. But he was faithful. Why? The greatest thing is that despite our failures, we're going to go through life and the pressure to compromise is going to be great. And many times we're going to fail because we're sinful human beings. We are weak human beings. We are broken. But the greatest thing about that is that God is coming. He is a God who remembers his promises to love us, to redeem us, to restore us. And he, despite our failures, will not run from us, will not leave us alone. Because of the cross of Jesus Christ, when we become Christians, we are his children. And then when we do fail, when we become like a Peter who denies Christ at the time when Christ needed him most, we see that Peter himself finds forgiveness and restoration despite his failures. We should not take this idea of compromise and holiness lightly, because the pressure to compromise is going to be great. And yes, we live in a life, I'm surrounded by Christians, I'm okay. But there's coming a time when it will be difficult, when it will be costly. And we need to be prepared for that. But when we do fail, we have a forgiving God who allows us, who takes our life and continues. So we need to understand, just like Daniel's faithful actions led him to thrive in a toxic culture, our faithfulness to our Savior, to God, will help us not only thrive, but also hopefully make an influence to those around us.